So today we will be launching or beginning our study on environment and climate impacts related to the Canadian financial system. At the end of the meeting, I will need 5 minutes to do an update of the invitation that we sent out to the CEOs of oil companies, but we ought to be able to settle that quite quickly. We have everyone's collaboration. So without further ado, for our first panel, we have Mr. Andrew Chisholm, Canada's expert panel on sustainable finance, and Ms. Barbara Zahn, President and Chief Executive Officer, Canada's expert panel on sustainable finance. And I've been informed that you wish to share the 10 minutes between the two of you. Is it Ms. Zahn who will begin for 5 minutes? Is that it? Is that it? Okay.
Yes,
Thank you.
That's fine, yes.
I don't know. It's up to you, but is Ms. Zahn going to start? Is that how it's planned? Okay, fine.
Good afternoon, chairs and members. So my name is Barb Svan, and I am, as noted, the President and CEO of the University Pension Plan, and I was also a member of the Sustainable Finance Action Council, and I was the chair of the Taxonomy Technical Expert Group. In addition to, I was one of the members of the expert panel on sustainable finance. As a representative of the finance community, I'm here to talk about the important link between economy, sustainable finance, and the environment. The Canadian economy is not faring as well as we like. In March, the Bank of Canada Deputy Governor said it was time to break the glass on productivity, warning us that Canada's lagging productivity had reached an emergency level. Against this economic backdrop, the effects of climate change are undeniably upon us. The last 12 months have been the hottest in recorded history. Last winter was 5.2 degrees warmer than historic norms, and 2023 marked our worst wildfire season. The economic toll of climate change on Canada's GDP, exports, and job losses are foreseeable. The global predictions released a few weeks ago are even more staggering. The 2022 federal budget estimated that Canada needs an additional $115 billion annually to meet our net zero commitments. This is an unprecedented investment opportunity that cannot be met by public funding. Being low carbon is a driver of competitiveness, and Canada is well placed to lever its expertise in the area of critical minerals, clean energy, and green transportation. The market is poised to grow as evidenced by the rapid growth in the green bond market and in green exports. Canada's low-carbon exports have grown by 9.4% between 2012 and 2023, outperforming the rate of growth of all other exports combined. To benefit from the market opportunities that support Canada's net zero goals, we need to unlock private sector investment potential and bolster the attractiveness of Canada as a net zero aligned investment destination. So what is holding us back? Well, there may be a myriad of reasons. Let me focus on my area of expertise, investments. When making long-term investments, Canadian and global investors alike look for as much certainty as possible by the way of credible information, proactive disclosures aligned with global standards, and confidence that projects and assets we're investing in will reduce carbon emissions in line with domestic and global commitments. Investors are looking for policy certainty around Canada's net zero transition priorities and for the right building blocks to mainstream sustainable finance in support of net zero goals. In 2018, the expert panel on sustainable finance examined ways to scale and align sustainable finance with Canada's climate and economic goals. We identified the importance of a taxonomy and disclosures as critical building blocks to mainstream sustainable finance and build market confidence. Our recommendations issued in 2019 included establishing the Sustainable Finance Action Council, or SFAC, to bring together stakeholders to develop Canada's taxonomy. The SFAC, which included significant representation from Canada's financial industry and regulators, provided its report in September 2022. We included a framework for a Made in Canada green and transition taxonomy, aligned with our net zero goals and economy, and in step with international expectations and other taxonomies. We also provided a proposed elements of a good governance model to get this off the ground. So what is a taxonomy? A taxonomy is a classification system. It will help channel capital toward projects that are either classified as green or, importantly and uniquely to Canada, to transition projects that will help companies reduce their carbon footprints in a stepwise way. The playbook for this already exists. Globally, there are more than 40 taxonomies already in place or under development, each customized to a specific country or region in order to link global capital markets with their respective net zero pathways. Most G7, many OECD countries, several resource-based economies, including Australia, and many developing countries have taxonomies. Kenya just published their draft taxonomy. A taxonomy, together with climate disclosure standards being developed by the International Sustainability Standards Board, which represents over 164 jurisdictions, would foster investor confidence, support the growth of Canada's sustainable finance market, and create an overall more attractive investment climate. This will in turn attract funding for Canada's clean tech sector, provide CapEx for operating companies, net zero plans, grow our economy, generate good jobs, and catalyze productivity growth. We have studied this issue extensively. The expert panel and the Sustainable Finance Action Council recommendations were presented in 2019 and in 2022, respectively. In the years that have passed, dozens of countries and regions have leapfrogged us, even leveraging our work. Business and investors are prepared to invest now. I urge you to put in the building blocks in place needed for Canada to be in the running to attract some of this investment to fund our transition. Thank you for your time and interest. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Mr. Chisholm.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in the session today. My name is Andy Chisholm. I was a member of the expert panel with Barb and others. For 30 years, my career was as an investment banker in New York and London. More recently, however, I've been involved in the sustainable finance arena in various ways. Among other activities, I'm an advisor to Arcturn Ventures, one of Canada's leading clean tech venture capital companies. And I'm an investor myself in early stage private companies that are involved in the clean tech space. And I'm also on the board of RBC and advisory boards of sustainability initiatives at two leading business schools. My comments today or observations follow from the original work on the panel and represent high-level reflections which are coming, as Barb says, 5 years later. My first observation is that the main tenets of the 2019 report still hold true. Specifically that if Canada wishes to succeed in its emissions reduction commitments in a timely manner, at the same time as taking advantage of the economic opportunities that arise from innovation in the face of climate change, it's essential that finance flows in an aligned manner. Further, that the amount of investment required to adjust energy systems and materials and industrial processes and to commercialize new technologies is well beyond the reach of the public sector. And in any case, ideally, would be the purview of the private sector actors. Hence, there's a need to create the conditions for the private sector to act in the context of our market-based economy. These conditions involve implementing new rules and regulations and standards, a number of which Barb has just referred to, in parallel with investing in infrastructure, supporting innovation, and timely commercial adjustment, as well as easing implementation challenges. My second observation is that approximately 5 years have passed since we published our report. That period represents something close to the half of the then available time to the year 2030, which is widely, as you know, widely used internationally as an important waypoint for measuring progress on emissions reduction. And while there has been significant progress made in sustainable finance on a number of fronts, and investment flows have grown significantly in very recent times, we're still falling well short on delivering emissions reduction. In part, this is because such capital flows and corporate investment is still meaningfully less than commentators suggest is necessary in order to reach the stated objectives. Meanwhile, important foundations for success in sustainable finance, which were outlined in that 2019 report, are still to be finalized in a Canadian context. Most notably, they include adjustments to corporate disclosure guidelines, the taxonomy Barb referred to, and the aspect of taxonomy being transition alignment being something of particular interest to the Canadian economy, which is relatively carbon intense. So why are these things so important? Markets operate more efficiently with better, more observable information. Consistency and clarity facilitate scale in financial activity. And in the face of uncertainty, many actors develop a go slow bias, waiting for information to become more clear. It's for this reason we must make more decisions more quickly, even if they are imperfect at the start. And success in achieving an orderly path towards decarbonization of the economy requires sufficient continuous progress. Otherwise, the gap widens and available time compresses, thereby increasing the likelihood of a disorderly transition and/or undershooting on the delivery of the original goals and commitments. Within both society and government, it's evident that we do not have a singular point of view. Therefore, a degree of pragmatism will be required to get to decisions faster in the interest of gaining ground and not losing more time. Such decisions should also consider the interoperability with provinces, territories, and also commercial partners, notably the US and Europe. My third observation is that to date, a high percentage of climate spending has come from government sources. Over time, the vast majority of capital investment activity will need to be initiated by the private sector. The private sector, both domestically and internationally, responds to signals that may intersect with but are not identical to those of government. As a result, to crowd in private market-based finance, especially in the context of the largest and most impactful projects, it's important that the interface between business and private sector finance and government be as efficient and effective as possible to ensure both public sector and private sector objectives are met. It's for this reason the relevant government departments would be well served by having a more coordinated approach to the sustainable finance file. Further, it would be beneficial that individuals involved in that file have strong senior business markets experience and relationships, allowing them to identify when and how best to employ blended finance techniques.
Mr. Chisholm, we're going to have to stop there to leave room, time for many questions.
Thank you for listening.
Well, it was very interesting. Thank you for presenting. Mr. Mazier, for 6 minutes, please.
Mr. Kennedy this afternoon. So this is for both of you. If Canada adopted all 15 recommendations in the final report of the expert panel on sustainable finance, how many emissions would be reduced in Canada as a direct result?
That's difficult math. So I would say that finance doesn't solve climate change, but everything that does requires essentially financing. Right? So when you think about a company who has to put in CCUS, or when a building has to do renovations, all that is backed by financing. So maybe if I reverse that question, for us to meet our emissions target without financing being aligned, you will not meet the goal.
I guess, so you mentioned CCUS, like how many emissions, if we, this is a 65-page report. You must have had some idea of how many emissions would have been reduced if these were implemented.
Yeah. So CCUS is critical in
Whole report, if all 15 recommendations were followed, like, what was your hope?
So our hope would be we would actually meet our target because we're enabling finance Canada's target. Canada has a 2050 net zero target. That requires significant investment, $115 billion annually as estimated by the federal government. That is beyond government's budgets.
Thank you. The CEO of the Canadian Pension Investment Board called Western Canada home to, and I quote, some of the most responsibly produced conventional energy in the world. Would you agree with these statements?
Yes. However, they still produce significant
that's good. You give me a
Scope
yes,
1 and
Mr.
Scope
Chisholm?
3 emissions.
It's very clear that as a country, we're economically dependent on a well-functioning energy system. And energy...
Just a simple yes or no. Would you agree with that statement?
I am not an expert in that particular field, but we are starting with a more carbon-intense series of processes than certain other parts of the world are. I understand we have made significant progress over time and should be commended for that progress. I also understand we have a long way to go.
Okay. Ms. Van, I think that's how you say. You're the CEO of the University Pension Plan of Ontario. How many emissions have been, okay, and the University Pension Plan of Ontario has excluded the mining of thermal coal from its investments. How many emissions have been directly reduced because of this decision?
It is part of our, so it's hard to say because part of it is we're not buying it.
What do you mean hard to say?
Because we have sold companies through our external managers that had thermal coal. We are well into reducing our targets this year we'll be meeting our 16% reduction in our emissions that we're going to be net zero by 2040. So it is part of a larger scale program.
So you don't know how many emissions are going to be directly?
I don't have the number off the top of my head, but I'm happy to provide it. But I can tell you that this year, all our collective policies together, we have reduced about 17% of our emissions in the 3 years that we've been
table that
up and
document
running.
that have been directly
Happy
reduced.
to provide
Okay,
that.
good. Ms. Van, in your speaking notes, you mentioned that the Canadian GDP and productivity are, and I quote, trending in the wrong direction with no turnaround in sight. And I agree with you. Yet, your report recommends more reporting regulations. Can you provide a specific example of when adding more regulations and disclosure requirements to Canadian businesses directly increase productivity?
So in terms of our companies being healthy, in terms of attracting financing and being able to create the jobs and productivity, reporting is becoming the norm. So let me give you an example. With ISSB, you will have 164 jurisdictions providing this reporting. In Climate Action 100 Plus, that has 700 investors behind it, they require this reporting. Money flows to where it goes the easiest. If Canadian companies are not providing this reporting, they will not have the attention of investors. And that therefore they cannot get financing and they cannot then do the things that they need to do.
So I guess it wouldn't increase productivity.
It would not increase productivity.
Thank you. How much will it cost a company to comply with the climate-related financial disclosures expectations of Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions?
So there is a cost. So we're planning to take on the same cost. However, I would note
how much does that cost?
So I don't know the cost off the top for those financial institutions. You know, banks have 90,000 employees, significant operations. It would be a significant cost to take those on. However,
like 1-2% of profits?
That you would need to ask a bank CEO for that. However, for them to be able to operate in a global landscape, they need to provide this reporting. Right? Money is not just coming, this is becoming the norm. And so the cost of not providing it means you are not getting the financing from global investors. And
But
I
yet
think
we
that
don't know
cost
what
is
the
much
cost
bigger.
is of providing it,
No, but I think
like directly.
the cost of not providing it and not getting the financing, right? So a really good example.
Yeah, we're time is up, but I think.
Point of order, Mr. Chair?
Yes, Mr. Vancouver.
Thanks. I waited until my colleague, Dan Mazer, was finished in order to say this. I think it's really, really important that we treat our expert witnesses with dignity and respect, allow them to finish their sentences when they've been asked a question directly, and allow them to get their thoughts out before they start a new question or demand a yes or no. I think it's really, really important that we treat witnesses who come here on their own time with that level of decorum. Thank you.
Point of order.
If I may on that,
Who made the point of order? Mr.
if I may on that, I'm very pleased to hear a Liberal saying that after what happened 2 days ago in another committee. The point is, when we ask a question, with all my respect, I will not repeat what your colleague from Prescott Russell said at the committee.
OK, bah, écoutez,
Because-
là,
but no, the point is that
on
what-
diverge un peu.
OK,
No,
no,
we're getting off course here. It's not a point of order. When a question is asked, yes or no, we need an answer. Listen, I don't mind. Sometimes what happens is it's true that the time is limited, and sometimes it's not the case today. We've had excellent testimony and excellent answers, but sometimes it does happen that a witness decides to speak for a long time. And sometimes you have to break them off politely, always politely. But it's going very well today. So I'm very pleased with the pace of things. So we will now turn to, let us turn to Ms. Chappelle. Continue. We're wasting time. Yes, Chair. Listen, I'm going to continue along the. Let's start again. Please go ahead. Thank you, Chair. Listen, I would like to continue along the same lines because you said, both of you, something that was very important and that is important to consider, which is what is the cost of inaction here? We have, in Canada, we have a great deal of things to attract investments from all around the world. But I note that we are getting into a delay in relation to the European and American markets and the Australian one. Unfortunately, we need as soon as possible to get the instruments, as you said, to provide certainty, to create an environment in which investors will be able to invest in our economy. So could you please continue along the line of examples of inaction, but also by comparison, because we're not in a silo in Canada. We're in competition with major markets. So what is happening in Europe? Why are they ahead in terms of taxonomy and on disclosure? And what can Canada do to speed things up and to stay in the mix? Mrs. Van and then Mr. Chisholm.
So Europe, they published their report in 2018. They have a full functioning taxonomy and disclosure regime broader than ISSB, or the International Sustainability. They're actually doing dual materiality under the European Reporting Sustainability Standards. So much more extensive. The reason why they're trying to funnel money to green opportunities. So they have very much wanted to make sure that the average person would know how their money is being managed, if it was managed aligned with climate. So there is ways now that there are funds very specifically aligned to that taxonomy, very much their mindset. They are using that taxonomy to assess companies' capex. So they are able to say the capex of oil and gas companies writ large is aligned to 15%. While as the rest of the sector as a whole is actually only 8%. So the oil and gas companies using this framework can demonstrate their greater alignment. When you look at Canada and what's the implications of not doing this? You have lack of clarity, so money doesn't come. You're employing a taxonomy. The other option is you're employing a taxonomy from another region. So that means the thresholds are not going to be relevant for Canada. They will still continue to fall behind international expectations. So when we compare Canadian high emitters to global ones, there's not a single Canadian company today that can articulate in their disclosures how their capital is aligned to the 1.5 degree scenario. Not one. Where over 40% of the high emitters globally can. And you have to realize capital will go to where it's easiest. This is a competition where capital goes. The total capital for Canada is $115 billion. McKinsey estimates that the capital needed globally for the transition in 2030 is $9 to $12 trillion. It will go wherever it is the easiest to ascertain good quality investments, along with the clarity that it's aligned to the transition. The additional...
Juste souligner quelque chose d'extrêmement important.
This is something very important, which you mentioned, that I'd like to emphasize. If Canada does not take action now, then billions of dollars of investments will be lost by Canada in the coming years. Is that right? Did I understand accurately? Yes, please continue.
So in addition, in terms of other costs, the financial institutions will each make their own taxonomy or bespoke version of it. It will never be as detailed or done with the same level of public consultation. So that will contribute to confusion. You will have lack of green bonds that have credibility. Green bonds issued with a credible taxonomy can save anywhere from 1 to 10 basis points. So that means that if you issue a $10 billion bond and you have a 4 basis point saving, that is $4 million each and every year for that life of that bond. And then you have the ability to ever leverage OSFI. So OSFI would like to align capital, which would align investments from the banks with the climate transition, and ultimately then back to the GDP and being able to do investments in Canada. You will have the continued reputational risk from greenwashing, because no investor will be able to know if the investment made by company X is aligned with Canada's transition. And you'll have the lack of ability to be in international dialogue. I can tell you I get invitations from World Bank and all sorts of groups to participate for Canada, which I cannot. So I would say, and ultimately, your ability to finance the transition in Canada.
Vous parliez tout à l'heure de OSFI, le bureau de surintendance.
Earlier, you talked about the Bureau of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions in Canada. OSFI, is that the best place to manage our taxonomy?
So in terms of international comparisons, we did a full review. Most taxonomies are overseen by the monetary authorities in the different countries. So the equivalent in Canada would be OSFI. They have all the powers today to do so. They just need a letter from the Department of Finance.
Merci, Madame Posey.
Thank you, Ms. Posey. Thank you to our witnesses for being with us on this issue. Just a moment, Chair. I can hear an echo.
No. Non, mais je
I'm hearing my voice. I speak. And
Parce que les interprètes ne sont pas en présentiel.
the interpreters are not here in person. They're online, and sometimes it has an effect on this. Well, what I'll do is I'll ask my questions without the microphone in order to get the answer afterwards. Okay, my apologies for this. Okay, so shall we start at 0, Chair? Thank you. So this is a topic that is not easy. We are here with you to get a better understanding. At your meeting last year, you came to the Finance Committee of the House of Commons. Finance, that's it. And you were witnesses, and I would like to cite you in Canada. We have 37 financial institutions in Canada that deal with the 40 largest emitters, to have a dialogue with a consistent image, to think about the long-term strategy of governance with your objectives. So you're saying that you would like to help them go through their transition, and you suggested that they be included in the taxonomy work plan. But don't you think that it's the role of the government to pass legislation and to set regulations, and then the businesses will adjust. I recall that Mr. Lord Dubin in England on the climate committee, I don't remember the exact name of the committee, who was saying, make the legislation and the businesses will follow suit. Wouldn't it be better to do that first rather than invite all the major emitters in to set their own recommendations on a taxonomy?
I would say that they're very different tools. I would say absolutely you need all the different toolkits. You need the regulation. Regulation feeds into taxonomy. It is not the other way around. Taxonomy governance usually has the official sector monetary authority at the top of the house who lead it, along with, in Canada's case, we recommended the provinces. We actually recommended the financial community take a step back and follow a minor portion of that. You have a secretariat with the skills to do the work, and then you have industry working groups. That is where industry and finance will pull together the recommendations that go to public consultation, ultimately approved. Policy regulation feeds into taxonomy. That feeds into what is Canada's transition. It's a translation tool.
Mais effectivement, je reviens encore.
Indeed, I return to businesses or major emitters, which you mentioned in the Finance Committee. We know that they will want, in any event, to continue without changes. And we think rather that we should change things if we want it to work. So I'm looking at your introductory notes, and you state that investors are seeking certainty in terms of policies surrounding Canada's priorities for the carbon neutral goals, but there is no regulatory framework set. So doesn't that undermine things or isn't that harmful for the investors?
So policy certainty would absolutely be very helpful in terms of what are the transition priorities. We put that in the expert panel. Andy can take a turn in answering. That was the first recommendation of the expert panel. That work has not been necessarily done by the federal government. It would be nice to have. I would agree it would make it a lot easier to do the taxonomies, but taxonomies ultimately are aligned with 1.5 degree scenarios. And that is the work, and it'll take in Canada's regulatory framework.
Vous pouvez nous dire quels
Can you tell us which aspects the government ought to demand in order to fill that out? Are there specific aspects that you can recommend?
I was going to look at Andy if you want to take that one.
From my perspective, I think there are a number of things. First of all, making sure that the disclosure regulations that are in play right now get nailed down will be very important. Number two, the taxonomy we talked about. Taxonomy is not a silver bullet, but it is part of the systems change that can be useful. A third aspect, which we have not spent enough time on, and the country has not spent enough time on, has to do with data. And being able to have much improved data systems for measurement, for transmission, how we use environment data together with business data, et cetera, on a sectoral basis can be strategically important and feed in very well.
Je vais vous interrompre. Je m'excuse de vous interrompre parce
I'm
que
sorry to interrupt you, but there are some things that you're telling us that are actually part of the recommendations of the final group of the expert panel on sustainable finance. Is that right?
Yes.
je vais vous poser une question.
So I'm going to ask you a question, particularly about recommendation 12, where we read the report of your organization that recognized building export pipelines, gas pipelines or oil pipelines. What is the link between sustainable finance and such specific projects?
First of all, if there is a transition plan on a country level, if there's a transition plan on a sectoral level, if there is a transition plan on a company level, they will involve actions which, to the extent that that they align with Paris-based objectives and science-based targets will need financing. Some of the gas that we all talk about may well be useful in the context of a transition for some period of time as a potential displacement of certain other much more harmful fossil fuels.
We're going to have to stop there, unfortunately. We're going to have to stop there. The 6 minutes is up. Ms. Collins.
That's okay. I actually think I will pick up exactly at that point. You're talking about gas, and I think there would be many climate experts and folks from civil society, indigenous groups who would contest whether natural gas is going to be an effective transition fuel or if we need to leapfrog. But I think the recommendation actually specifically mentions oil. And so you are advocating for oil export pipelines in this, which is to me shocking in an expert panel on sustainable finance. And one thing that caught my eye at the end of that recommendation was with a clear pledge from industry. And given that we've seen industry fail time and time again, greenwash, make climate commitments and then roll those back while making record profits, how is it that we're supposed to trust oil and gas companies and the financial institutions who profit off of them to really recommend a pathway forward when we're facing a climate emergency?
So I'll try. At the Sustainable Finance Action Council, we focused on the oil and gas. If you look at the report, what is included is the decarbonization of the oil and gas sector. Why did we do that? It is about 30% of the emissions today is the oil and gas sector. We will not meet our targets if we do not deal with this sector while we need to use their product. That is why we do it. It does not include the production of oil and gas. It includes decarbonization activities, such as methane, CCUS, and those sorts of things.
And I have some questions about
in the report.
I have some questions about those as well. But I think the issue that I'm trying to really get to is the recommendation that is really in support of specific export pipelines to build them. And so I think what you're talking about is decarbonizing the production, et cetera. We also know that once the oil and gas is shipped overseas, it's going to be burned, and that will increase emissions. And I'm curious if that played a role in your decision-making around recommending, in support of building oil export pipelines.
The comments that I would make have to do with simply a practical reality, which was even more true in 2019 than today, that roughly 80% of global energy needs currently come from fossil fuels. And it's important that we have an orderly transition. The expert panel were strong advocates for the notion of transition and meeting our Paris-aligned goals in a science-based way. But in doing that, recognizing that there needs to be a glide path, there needs to be a pathway so that we do not end up with a disorderly transition, which can involve price shocks, lack of supply, which then would act in a counterproductive manner to the ability to bring society along to the kind of direction and glide path we need.
On mute.
I hear that, and I guess the language that's used in the report is talking about Canada's cleaner, more responsibly produced oil and gas. When Canada's home to the oil sands, which is producing some of the highest cost, highest emitting, the farthest from clean energy that I can imagine. Is that what your report?
We certainly concurred with some of the notion of what you just mentioned, which is in order for Canada to continue to be in a legitimate position to export to produce and export its fossil fuel-based product, it is going to be essential over time that we strive to be among the very lowest in terms of emissions intensity and with regard to cost.
And Chair, just how much longer do I have?
More than a minute.
Okay, great. I guess maybe I will switch to some questions about the taxonomy itself. And you've already captured some of the reason why it might be different from the EU taxonomy. And while that taxonomy isn't perfect, I do think the key difference that I see is the difference between what is a transition or what is considered kind of transition fuel, transition, and it appears to me that the EU is really looking that we don't lock in carbon intensive assets, whereas this kind of made in Canada one seems to have put in a bunch of loopholes that allows for that carbon lock-in.
So remember, the taxonomy recommendation says it has to be aligned with 1.5 degrees. It cannot extend the current lifespan of the production. There is no new production that's included, and it only includes the financing of decarbonizing that existing production. And that's because right now, it produces 30% of Canada's emissions and growing. So if we don't deal with decarbonizing this sector while we use it, doing everything else will be harder. And that is why we included it. EU took a certain approach, but I can tell you Australia is running with our approach. You have the Asian region doing transition. You have Japan doing transition through model cases. And you have New Zealand doing transition.
We'll have to stop there, unfortunately, and start our second round, which is a 5-minute round with Mr. Deltel.
Mr. Chairman, welcome to our witnesses to our committee of the House of Commons. Ms. Zan, at the basis of your argument is taxonomy, which is a classification system which directs capital to green projects. Let me speak to a concrete example we're seeing in Quebec. And nothing is black and white. There's always a gray area. I'd like to speak about the Northvolt project, which is $7 billion for a battery plant. And again, this is to produce electric vehicles anyway. But we know that this project is making waves in Quebec, but unfortunately some criminal elements also recently placed incendiary objects on the site. And this affects everybody. So, Ms. Zan, my point is this. Some say this is excellent for the environment because it's to help electric vehicles, and we need them. Others say, careful, this is in a wet area, and this kind of car is not necessarily the best thing for the environment, nor has there been any consultation to build this project. So on the one hand, some people think it's good, others think that it is not good. So in your own reading, where would you place this project, on top of the list, in the middle, or at the bottom of that list?
So I don't know enough of the project to put on the list, but the point of having a taxonomy would be for financiers to know if that project meets certain level of specification scientifically, and then for us to be able to say, does it meet those requirements or not, and have clarity if it's aligned or not. Right now, we don't have clarity at all. It's exactly that confusion and debate that slows down investors to be in those sorts of projects.
Let
me give you another example. Since I'm a critic in climate change and environment, every week, every month, I meet with dozens of groups from the manufacturing milieu where people want to improve their carbon footprint. Now I'm dealing with people working on packaging. They're saying if they want to achieve this government's objectives, they have to ensure the packaging is bigger and thicker. What does this mean? It means that to achieve the number indicated by scientists, we have to produce more. In other words, the efficiency gain we think we can realize through this objective that we've set is zero because we have to produce something larger at the same time. So my question is this. So according to you, is this a good investment to continue to invest in a company that had noted that if you stick to the government rules, we will have a higher carbon footprint because due to the production, we have to produce a thicker product that is more difficult to produce, pollutes more if we produce a thinner one, which reaches the objectives. But unfortunately, this will increase the carbon footprint. So what is your vision of this? How would you assess this? Is this, again, positive, middle, or low?
So when investors work with those sort of companies, so if I look at the engagement initiative, what we would expect is disclosure, how their capital is aligned, and a transition plan. Investors are very understanding if government put in rules that says you have to do certain things. But what we want to know is what's their long-term plan in terms of how are they going to meet the 2050 goals. It's different by industry, and we assess them differently by industry. So I think if it's a government-imposed thing, investors take that into account. But the problem is that we don't have companies actually articulating what their decarbonization strategies are at all.
And so who will call the shot? Who will call the shot? Qui va définir?
Who will define what is at the top of the list? I'm sorry, I do need to put my glasses on for this. Who will be on top of the list of taxonomy? Who will be in the middle? Who will be lower? Who will define those?
The governance around taxonomies usually involves a council at top. So think of it as a board. It's usually chaired by the Monetary Authority with significant representation from monetary. So official sector, Bank of Canada, OSFI, those groups would be equivalent here. They oversee the initiative. They usually, in the middle, have a secretariat that the council picks to do the day-to-day work, that hires the experts from different sectors to develop the technical specifications. Those specifications are shared with industry and finance for feedback and then go to public consultation.
For that?
So that is typically funded by the government because investors want to see the government backing these things. It is about $4 million to do 4 sectors a year.
Thank you.
That is easily regrouped by a $10 billion bond issuance.
Mr. Longfield.
I feel compelled to ask if you can finish your sentence because you haven't had a chance to finish some of your sentences today. Are you finished on that sentence?
If the government of Canada can issue credible green bonds, there is literature now and research out there that says you can save on the cost of capital. They estimate it if you have a credible issuance that's somewhere between 1 and 9 basis points. That means on a $10 billion issuance, you save on average about $4.5 million a year. So it does come back to investors, but it has to be credible. It is not credible without a taxonomy.
Great. And thank you for the work you've done on the taxonomy. I remember having a few conversations with Kathy Bardswick, who was chairing the Action Council. That was an area that we really needed to get across the line. And there were many, many complications internationally and through business, as well as the different levels of government in Canada. Could you maybe speak to, and this is for Ms. Svan, could you speak to what challenges are remaining? I'm thinking of Alberta politically moving away from clean technology and what that might help, or what that might do to investor confidence, or what that might do in terms of taxonomy, or is taxonomy pretty well set now?
There's now about 40 taxonomies done globally, done or developing. Alberta can, the question is whether Canada does one and follows the pattern.
Yep.
These are recommendations that come from World Bank, OECD, the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action. This is not new.
Yep.
So Alberta can do whatever. It's whether Canada puts this in place. That's the question.
And I think, and also to Mr. Crisson, to see your professionalism as well as the membership list. This was the who's who in the financial markets. These are the people that, as yourself, if I may, to look objectively and to say capital will find a place. And if you don't open the right signals and doors and make sure that things are being followed through, capital will just pass by you into another region.
Yes, and I think that is a very, very strong point, and we're already seeing it to a degree. We're seeing countries like China, ironically, much maligned with their coal, dominating solar, dominating wind, dominating EVs, dominating batteries, dominating battery materials, dominating electric transmission. And I think we have outsized opportunity in Canada for a lot of reasons to participate in some of the change and take advantage and ultimately end up with a bigger slice of the pie than even what we have right now economically around the world. But we have to be early, and we have to be thoughtful, and we have to be aggressive. I see in my clean tech work, there's already some companies that are young, have potential, that are moving to the U.S. for various reasons.
Sure.
We run big risks here.
And so on that, and it's not fair to ask witnesses to weigh into the political discussions of the day. And I think capital is one of those fortunate or unfortunate areas where politics almost doesn't matter. It's the markets that decide. China is showing an example there that even a regime that's not democratic, that doesn't respect human rights, can still attract capital. Could you comment on the importance, though, of having a stable political climate where we are working together on climate change versus we're all going to axe the tax and walk away from any financial incentives?
Well, I would say there's no question in a democracy you are always going to have differences of opinions, and that's a good thing. And there will be ebbs and flows in terms of political leadership that occur. Stability can be useful, but democracy has its own aspects to it. I would say the kind of stability that is really essential is long-term planning around what expectations are going to be around market functions, around rule bases. Absolutely, as we said at the expert panel, an example, we thought having a price on carbon was important. Yep. And it was important that there is a price on carbon that one can rely on for some period of time.
And clearly that's
how you do it is up for debate.
Yeah. And it's not a political statement, it's a capital statement.
We'll have to go to Madame Posé now.
Thank you. Sorry to talk over you. Thank you.
It's a very interesting discussion.
On vient de toucher le sujet brûlant.
2 minutes et demie.
2 minutes et demie. Écoutez, je vais vous parler de ce qui se passe.
2.5 minutes. I'd like to talk about our border with the United States. For instance, last month, the American budget, Senate Budget Committee published, and the House of Representatives published a report. Overall, they're saying that this massive campaigns launched by the oil companies that present CCUS as being an available and viable solution to the rising greenhouse gas emissions. But internally, these companies do not intend to deploy this technology that apparently is necessary to stop climate change. But the actual objective of the industry actually to extend indefinitely the use of fossil fuels. So I'd like to state that. Also, last May 1st, the Capital Power Corporation in the United States announced that it was removing its CCUS project because this project was estimated at $2.4 billion. And they're saying that it's not economically viable for them. So it's not economically viable. It doesn't bring any benefits to investors, and it's absolutely not good to reach the Paris Accord agreement objectives. So why is the financial sector supporting the proposal to include the CCUS in its next taxonomy?
CCS is not just for oil and gas, it's also for heavy industry. So again, we said that it should be explored, that the people with the technical expertise should put the specifications around it. Companies will decide if it's economically viable, but it is the investors said that for many industries, not just oil and gas, CCUS is a reality for them to meet their net zero commitments. On the point about the companies and their net zero transitions, I'll give you a good case in point what we're starting to see. Woodside, which is a big LNG producer in Australia, recently had their climate plan turned down by investors by 58%. That means investors told the company, we don't believe in your climate plan, it's not aggressive enough, go back and redo it. Typically, that is the first step, and if investors don't see a change, they start voting off the directors. That is the power of investors. But how do we know if it's credible or not? It's because there's disclosure, And there's a taxonomy that helps form the analysis of what is credible.
Thank you. On a terminé.
On a terminé?
Oh.
I'm afraid your time is up.
And so I'm going to kind of pick up there. A February 2024 report showed that, the companies that are the publicly traded companies that are part of the world's largest corporate GHG emitters, including some in the Pathways Alliance, aren't actually disclosing the most basic and accessible data, relevant quantitative assumptions and estimates, inputs used in financing reporting. So the report finds that the members of Pathway Alliance fail in their financial statements to demonstrate how material climate-related matters are incorporated into their financial statements, be consistent with the company's other reporting, disclose climate-related assumptions. How are investors going to navigate this without key information that they need to assess the risks in their portfolio?
That is exactly what we're after. Transparency, information, proper data, deciding whether things fall within an acceptable framework. But it all starts with transparency, measuring the data, and communicating the data.
And so specifically with CCUS, I think CCUS for those heavy emitting things like cement, steel, makes sense. But why would we not exclude the fossil fuel industry that is hiding data and clearly increasing their emissions year after year?
Right. So again, back to what the SFAC today is asked to finance, or finances the sector. What we're trying to say is help us get the disclosure and the scientific information through a taxonomy so we can do the proper evaluation of these companies. So I think we're saying the same thing. Everyone's using this, but the tools that we have to measure the quality of their transition plans are not in place, and other global investors will not find them in place. So you're asking for clarity on CCUS, so are we. But without those tools, we will not have clarity. And we will not have credible transition plans.
Okay, 10 seconds left, basically. So. Okay.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for being here today. Ms. Van, I was particularly interested in the PowerPoint presentation that you provided to us prior to the meeting. I wouldn't mind starting off with slide number 17, where it has the categories of green activities. And you listed SMRs as a green activity. Can you elaborate a bit as to why SMRs and nuclear energy should be considered green activities, and how nuclear energy in general can be beneficial to a green economy?
So as most know, the nuclear is low in emissions or no emissions. In the report, we said that the key part of nuclear, including small modular reactors, not just the big nuclear plants that we think about, need to work through do no significant harm. So do no significant harm is an element of all taxonomies. You cannot compromise other objectives to reduce emissions. So that would be part and parcel of its inclusion for the technical expertise to say what is the standard from an environmental point of view of do no significant harm in that industry before it meets the qualifications.
So you're of the view then that nuclear energy is not harmful in terms of a green economy?
So nuclear plays a role because its emissions are, right, no emissions. So SMRs are, think of SMRs to replace diesel in the north, right? The challenge we have is the waste product, and that is the part that needs to be solved, and for people to tell the finance industry what does good look like. It's not for us to say what good looks like.
Okay. Do you have any particular recommendations for the committee when it comes to nuclear energy and how we can increase investment in nuclear energy? But besides the taxonomy, of course.
Andy, please go ahead.
I would say two things. One, obviously, it is going to have a very elongated process of evaluation and licensing and accreditation, and it should. Having said that, we should be introspective as to whether there is a way to do that in a faster manner, because the timeframes are 10 plus years, and that's hard. Beyond that, I think assuming that we can get through that safety, the accreditation, the proper process of evaluation, identifying where these solutions can best operate and help facilitate the procurement and the installation and the execution of some of these projects.
So for something like nuclear energy, why is a system of taxonomy necessary or beneficial? I mean, doesn't everybody already know that nuclear energy doesn't produce greenhouse gases?
So, but not everybody understands what this good environmental do no significant harm element is. So for us to include it as part, so as a company who's trying to issue green bonds, the first step, and you have to follow something called the International Capital Markets Association's Green Bond Principles, or ICMA principles. The first step is to say, what taxonomy are you referring to? There is no taxonomy today that a Canadian nuclear company can point to that says, I meet these thresholds. So they are not seen as credible, and they could be subject to greenwashing complaints. So it is the bridge between understanding what the scientists and environmentalists say what's good look like, to helping the finance community actually issue these green bonds or say they are aligned with the transition.
Okay, I'd like to come back to the final report from the expert panel that we were talking about a few minutes ago. When it comes to Canadian oil and gas exports, it's my understanding that they can play a vital role in displacing the burning of coal in other countries, most notably China. Is the displacement of greenhouse gas emissions in other countries a consideration in the taxonomy system being proposed?
So the taxonomy deals with the region that we're in. What is the requirements for this region? The requirements for another region are developed by that country, right? They will say, what does good look like? If Canada can provide the solution, there's Article 6, which is a whole nother issue that, right, to get the credits for those emission reductions. But we would not, as part of the taxonomy, be specifying what their emission reductions would look like.
Thank you. We'll go to Mr. Van Koeverden now.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here. And Ms. Van, I'll ask my questions to you, and I think you've done a great job of pointing to your colleague whenever it's necessary, so you kind of quarterback. So first, something that I know my colleagues across the way and everybody here will agree with, I am not an expert by any stretch of the imagination on sustainable finance. And the first time I heard the word taxonomy in this context, I thought we were talking about stuffing large trout and ducks on the wall, and then I realized there's a difference between taxidermy and taxonomy, but that was news to me at the time. And now that I understand that we're talking about definitions and terminologies for new categories for sustainable finance that didn't exist 25 years ago, I'm starting to understand a little bit. But what I do know is that the grass grows where you water it, and businesses grow where you invest. And with a pension fund or any large financial operation, you control a lot of money. And you have the ability to sort of put it into an agriculture context, control the sunlight and the water, and control where things grow. So I try to make it simple for myself and recognize that when you deprive certain sectors or industries of money that they've relied on for a long time, you might actually be able to force them to grow less fast. And if that's an industry that is super emissions intensive, like oil and gas production or cement or something like that, you're actually forcing them to innovate. And that's super, super powerful. Am I getting this right?
So investors first step is to engage with companies. So Climate Action 100 plus 700 investors, the Canadian equivalent has $6 trillion. We will ask for very clear things. We want governance on climate. We want a strategy on climate. We want metrics that are sector relevant. And we want your lobbying to be aligned with Canada's net zero. We measure all of those. We make that public. We also do our voting. So just like the Woodside, right? We will vote against companies on their climate plans. We will vote against directors. The last step when we don't see change is divestment, which would then increase the cost of capital for that company. That is the typical progression. investors are in different stages of that for the oil and gas company.
Thank you. That's super helpful. And is that similar? Is it a similar approach that banks will take? Pension funds and banks take a similar approach, or?
So banks typically help companies underwrite debt that eventually gets to different asset owners. So some asset owners, like pension plan, buy more equity. Insurance companies buy more debt. So they will often help facilitate the underwriting of that debt to go out to other parties. They will help underwrite loans to get loans and provide those loans. They're required to keep capital against those loans. That's where I turn to Andy as a bank director. So he can talk to bank, I can talk to the pension world.
One of the important points in this realm is that the banks can be a very constructive force, much less so in the context of inclusion, exclusion, much more so in the context of helping clients devise their transition plans and then helping them to finance them once they've devised credible transition plans, because they have scads of clients that are going to need help.
Thank you for that. And now I know that all Canada's 5 big banks, they also control a lot of funds. They buy a lot of assets for mutual funds and different types of assets for folks, and they've all committed to net zero by 2050. I'd like to know, I'd like to have some confidence as to whether or not these institutions are living up to some of those commitments, because there's been, a lot of concerns and allegations about greenwashing and sort of convincing folks that, hey, like if you want a green bank, you can count on us. You can count on us to invest in places where, we're going to deprive water and sunlight from organizations who are doing more harm than good, or they're not forcing innovation, or they're not talking about transition or encouraging that conversation. Is there good evidence to suggest that some banks are doing a little bit more greenwashing than others?
I would say, first of all, banks are doing a lot. Second of all, banks need to do a lot more. Third thing I would say is the Canadian banks signed on largely to something, the Net Zero Banking Alliance, which was concentric with Glasgow COP in the end of 2021. So it was at that point that they were making their commitments to align, the end of 2021. And so we are relatively early in that journey of dealing with clients, changing processes, changing systems, changing orientation.
Merci. Alors, ça met fin à ce panel qui fut...
This concludes this panel, which has been extremely interesting. Thank you for having assisted us in understanding the issue.
Alors, on va prendre une petite pause pour passer...
We're going to take a brief break, after which we will once again welcome the Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development for the second hour. Thank you once again to our witnesses. It has been extremely interesting. You really have forced us to dig deep. Thank you very much.
On n'a pas de temps à perdre. On a pris un peu de retard.
In fact, I'm afraid we're a little bit behind. We are now welcoming the Environment Commissioner. We all know him. We know Mr. Nadeau, Mr. Lequin. And we're going to try and close at 5:45 at the latest. I would require 5 to 10 minutes at the end, however, in order to glean your feedback regarding the visits of the oil company CEOs. Without further ado, Commissioner, you have 10 minutes. 6 minutes, rather.
Environment and climate impacts related to the Canadian financial system. I would like to acknowledge that this hearing is taking place on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. Joining me today are Mathieu Lequin and Jean-François Nadeau, who are respectively principal and director in our office. My remarks today are based on 3 reports we published in recent years on this matter. These are our 2021 Lessons Learned from Canada's Record on Climate Change, our 2022 research paper on climate-related financial disclosure, and our 2023 report on the supervision of climate-related financial risks by the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions, also known as OSFI. First, our 2021 Lessons Learned from Canada's Record on Climate Change clearly illustrated the cost associated with weather-related events in Canada, which were equivalent to 5 to 6% of annual gross domestic product growth. These costs have real consequences for households and business owners. For example, a major lender recently announced that it would no longer accept new mortgages for homes in high-risk flood zones. The consequences of such decisions on the value of residential housing, which for many households is the main asset, could prove quite dire. Notre rapport sur les leçons tirées a également révélé
Our report on lessons learned also indicated that financial decisions in Canada must take climate change into account if climate risks are to be mitigated. To do so, it is important for households, companies, and governments to be able to understand their exposure to such risks and to develop plans to manage them. Climate-related financial disclosures are necessary stepping stones toward that goal. Our 2022 research paper on climate-related financial disclosures looked at the state of various initiatives that were underway in Canada to improve the disclosure of climate-related financial information. We mentioned that despite the decentralized nature of the regulatory frameworks for financial disclosures more generally, both with the provinces and territories being responsible for securities regulations within their own jurisdictions, Canada must address the lack of transparency, inconsistencies, and the quality of climate-related financial disclosures. And finally, financial regulators must ensure that financial institutions, as stewards of the savings of Canadians, are managing climate-related financial risks appropriately. Our 2023 report on OSFI's supervision of climate-related financial risks examined whether the office incorporated climate-related financial risks into its risk management systems and frameworks for federally regulated financial institutions and pension plans.
Towards integrating climate risks into its supervisory framework, but that full implementation was still years away. We also highlighted an opportunity for OSFI to consider how to adapt its role to further Canada's whole-of-government approach to climate change and sustainable development. Since we released that audit, we have noted some positive developments. For example, OSFI has created an information page entirely dedicated to climate risks and expanded its outreach to stakeholders by creating the Climate Risk Forum. The development of the forum is in line with one of our audit recommendations. It also launched a public consultation on the standardized collection of climate-related emissions and exposure data. And finally, OSFI tabled its first departmental sustainable development strategy. Mr. Chair, this concludes my opening remarks. We would be pleased to answer any questions the committee may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. As I mentioned to the committee before, I need a good 5 to 10 minutes at the end. So I'm going to make the first round a 5-minute round and the second round a 4-minute round, and then we should land on time. Mr. Mazier.
Here we go. Thank you, Chair. Thank you. Nice to see you again, Commissioner. Commissioner, you're working in the Office of the Auditor General, correct?
That's an easy one, yes. Are they all going to be that easy today?
Well, we'll see. You have the powers to audit and investigate government programs, correct?
Yes.
Last week, you confirmed that you've never seen the government's entire carbon tax emissions model. I sent you a letter this week. Did you receive it?
Yes, I received it, and our team is in the process of drafting a response today.
Perfect. Thank you. I look forward to seeing that response. Yeah. Now that Canada's emissions have gone up again, will you launch an audit and compel the government to hand over the entire carbon tax emission model?
Appel au règlement, Monsieur le Président.
Madame,
Call to order. Listen, we've just learned, we're in an urgent situation here, and I'm searching for the relevancy of this question by Mr. Mazier.
It seems we're going off on a bit of a tangent, Mr. Mazier. I don't know if you can relate it to this study.
They talked about transparency and being able to have credible data. It has to be based off of something, and we need a model. So.
Keep in mind that, we're on the edge there.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Let's go.
But they need data. Thank you. So here's the question. Now that Canada's emissions have gone up again, will you launch an audit and compel the governments to hand over the entire carbon tax emissions model?
So I have committed to do more than the bare minimum under the newish Net Zero Act, which required a report on Canada's performance in mitigating climate change at least every 5 years. We issued our first one last year, and we will issue another one this fall. In the course of that audit, if we determine that we need all of that information, we will request it. We're still halfway through that audit, so I can't commit yet as to exactly what the nature of our information requests will be, but we do have an audit ongoing regarding Canada's mitigation measures and the effectiveness thereof.
Thank you. This study is examining private and public funding mechanisms to achieve emissions reductions. Last week, you exposed the Liberal government's $8 billion Net Zero Accelerator Fund. You revealed the government signed off on the majority of funding agreements without any commitments to reducing emissions. What companies have received money through the Net Zero Accelerator without a commitment to reduce emissions?
So I don't have those reports with me this week because I was here last week speaking about them. But if memory serves correctly, 12 of the 17 did not have commitments to emissions reduction. And I believe that the department committed to giving this committee a list of the 17 last week, if I recall correctly. So I don't have that information available, but I do believe the department is going to forward that based on my recollection of the proceedings last week.
So that would include the ones that without a commitment to reduce emissions?
Should be 12 of those 17, yes.
Okay, thank you. How much time and money does it cost a federally regulated financial institution to comply with the annual climate-related financial disclosure expectations of the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions?
So climate risks are one of newer of the many risks that OSFI requires federally regulated institutions to comply with. Have they broken down the cost of compliance for the climate risk specifically amongst all the other risks? I do not know, but I'm not sure if the committee is going to invite OSFI as part of this study, but that would be a question you could pose to them to see if they have parsed it out. But there's a whole range of risks that institutions have to manage under OSFI guidelines, climate being one of the newer ones.
Were there any assessments conducted on how much money, paperwork, and time it would take for a company to meet these disclosure guidelines?
At the time of our audit, I don't recall OSFI having provided any estimate that, as I said, parsed out specifically, guideline B15, I think is what you're speaking about. I don't think I've seen it. Whether it exists, I guess you'd have to ask OSFI if they have that.
Okay, thank you. I guess back to my other question too. There was 12 companies you mentioned that did comply and did not comply. Or which way were? Back to my other question about the companies that received from the Accelerator Fund without that commitment to reduce emissions. But there was 12 other companies?
So 17 received funding. 5 had commitments for quantifiable emission reductions. 12 did not.
And we'll get a list of those 12 as well.
That's my understanding from the undertaking from the department last week.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for that clarification.
Time's up. We'll go to Ms. Taylor-Roy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the Commissioner for joining us once again at our committee and talking about the very important issue of sustainable finance. I did want to go back to a question that's been raised about the cost of reporting and the disclosures and guidelines and what companies would have to do to provide the transparency needed to assure investors that they were not greenwashing, that they in fact were part of this sustainable transition. And do you feel there's any merit or any concern that the reporting requirements would somehow outweigh the benefit that Canada would receive from actually being able to represent that we are confident that these companies are indeed not greenwashing, that they meet the requirements of the international board?
So as I mentioned before, I haven't seen any specific costing related to firms having to undertake the data collection, analysis, and reporting for climate-related disclosures. They already are doing a lot of disclosures relating to the traditional risks, so this would be on top of that, but I don't know what the incremental amount would be. But there is always some cost to adding a new accountability and transparency mechanism. There's a cost for accountability bodies such as this committee to run. There's a cost for our office, which is an accountability mechanism to run. And there's a cost associated with an accountability measure such as climate-related disclosures. But I don't know if OSFI has attempted to quantify that in terms of the cost to the average cost to each firm, no.
But given that they haven't quantified that, do you have any major concerns that we should not be moving this direction because of the possible cost of disclosure versus the benefit that Canada would get from actually having this transparency and this accountability?
It's not something that we, in the course of our research paper in 2022 and in the course of our audit in 2023, we did not hear of any major concerns that the costs of compliance with climate-related disclosures would outweigh the benefits thereof.
Thank you. And in terms of the last the emissions report, I think the member earlier said that we had our highest level. We're at our highest level now. I was wondering if you could comment on what you think the level that we reached, the 708 megatons, which was actually 44 megatons less than pre-COVID, whether you see this as concerning this, that it's gone up slightly from COVID, or do you see this as going in the right direction?
So going in the right direction would be year over year decreases in total emissions. Because recall, we're just, for 2026, Canada is just trying to get back to approximately where it started in 1990 when it ostensibly began getting serious about fighting climate change along with its partners across the world. So I would be satisfied if we were seeing year over year decreases that roughly matched the line of the graph line that would get us to the 2026 objective and the 2030 target of 40 to 45%. Right now, we're still above 1990 levels, and I'd like to see us getting down at least to returning to 1990 levels by 2026 and to 40 to 45% below by 2030. So to answer your question, no, we're not quite on a year-over-year steady decrease. We're seeing some major drops associated with two severe economic events. The last one being COVID, not just an economic event, but it certainly had an impact on emissions. I would like to see year-over-year decreases from here to 2030, and then thereafter to 2050.
Surely, from here going forward. But the estimates that I had seen were that actually the expectation and the increase from the COVID pandemic years, the economic hit we took, were greater than what we've seen. So if you compare them to the 14.2 megatons forecast by the Canadian Climate Institute, we actually did much better. And would you say that those years 2020 and 2021 were aberrations?
Unfortunately, we have to move on to Madame Posé, but I think Ms. Taylor-Roy articulated the point. But Madame Posé, thank you.
Merci d'être de nouveau avec nous.
Thank you for coming back here to talk to us, and thank you to your team as well. So we've talked a lot about greenwashing. We talked about it with the first panel, and we mentioned it earlier. There was a complaint that was made recently by sustainable finance experts in Ontario and in Quebec in January 2024, and they identified over $10 billion in loans that were given to fossil fuel companies that were increasing their emissions despite their commitments. So this is not the first time that I've heard you say that there's no transparency, there's no accountability, there's a lack of information. Can we rely on our data? How are we going to make progress if there's a fault in everything that we do, so that companies can just go around the regulations, because there's no legislative framework? Well, with respect to federal institutions, so the bank, we too have concerns with regard to greenwashing. So yes, one of the recommendations in our report on OSFI a year ago, so recommendation 63 says that to reinforce the accountability of regulatory organizations towards the transition and to avoid greenwashing, the office has to set more specific rules of elements that have to be provided in the translation report. So we talked about federally regulated organizations, the bank, and so forth. But the provinces as well have to try to avoid greenwashing as well. But if we don't have reliable data, it's complicated. If it's companies that are giving us their own data, we can't always count on that. All right, so the EU directive is requiring that companies talk about not only about the risks that they're facing, but the impact on environmental and social factors. So it's what they call it the double materiality. So could that not be beneficial here with regard to our own objectives and for our financial resilience, so that investments that encourage would benefit the environment and social commitments? And I'm thinking of health, for example. Anything environmental issues. Yes. Well, listen, as the commissioner, sustainable development includes many factors, the economy, social factors, and so forth. So I agree with you. We need to look at everything. We don't want to just look at climate, for example. We need to look at everything in an integrated manner. And that's the vision of sustainable development. So how does Canada compare with its peers in terms of the alignment with the financial sector and sustainable development? Are there leading governments in the world in terms of financial disclosure? So I guess that's two small questions there. I have 30 seconds left, so I'm bunching them together. All right, I think that was lesson number 4 in our report from 2024, or 21 rather. So Canada is behind other countries when it comes to investments and in environmental resilience. So I know I have to be succinct here, but so lesson number 4 addresses that question. All right, thank you. Ms. Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank the Commissioner for being with us today. And maybe just to start off, just to frame up our conversation, you know, in your last year's report on the emissions reduction plan, you said the federal government is not on track to meet the 2030 target to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by at least 40% below the 2005 level by 2030. Do you consider that statement still factual?
We'll have more to say on that with our fall report, our second report under the Net Zero Act, but I haven't seen anything yet from the government that has shown that they've bridged the gap between their own estimation that they were in the mid-30s, that the measures they had in place were in the mid-30s%, the gap between that and 40 to 45%, which is their target. We also had concerns that even their calculations of getting into the mid-30s, whether it was 34 or 36%, that there were some overly optimistic assumptions. So we weren't even sure that 34 or 36% was bankable, especially having regard to the fact that we've had 30 years of plans and targets and not one of them has been met. And that, as I said last week, may be cause for the government perhaps to go for something a little bit more than 40%, knowing that each time it's aimed for a target in the past, it's come well short. Even the last target, which happened to fall within COVID, the target was not met, despite the economic downturn and the related emissions reductions associated with the economic downturn. So I haven't seen anything yet to indicate they've bridged the gap with measures that will add up to 40 to 45% based on reasonable assumptions. We'll have more to say about that in the fall with our second Net Zero Act report.
Thanks so much. And so I'm going to take from that the federal government is not on track to meet our 2030 target. Now, on this report, the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions, Canada, you talk about how they are a key supervisor of Canada's financial institutions, and you mention in your report they should consider whether it's appropriate to look beyond our current approach and find ways to advance Canada's broader climate goals. Now, some governments, like the UK and the EU, have aligned financial supervisors' mandates with sustainability objectives. Can you talk a little bit about the impact of Canada not doing this?
Yeah, so Canada has set out what's called a whole of government approach to tackling climate change. Another analogy is all hands on deck. So it's open to Canada as responsible for meeting its own target to determine which institutions are going to be involved in that whole of government approach to meeting the target. Most recently, the list of institutions subject to Canada's Federal Sustainable Development Act moved from only 20-something to approximately 100, and OSFI is now within that 100, and our own office is now within that 100. So we all have a potential part to play in meeting whole of government targets or objectives like the climate objective, the climate target of 40 to 45%. We do point out in our report that thus far OSFI has taken a narrow view of its mandate and stuck to the stability of the financial system, while other countries have chosen to have their equivalents of OSFI take a more active role in contributing to climate change mitigation efforts. And it's a policy question that's open to the government to answer.
And you talk about how action is overdue and is now urgent. To what extent do you think that our current financial systems and the lack of climate alignment, what role is that playing in our overall greenhouse gas emissions?
Well, I mean, Canada's overall trend in greenhouse gas emissions has not been positive, as we just spoke about. It's up from 1990 to now, whereas the other G7 countries have decreased their emissions. But how much of that is attributable to the lack of climate-related disclosures? I haven't seen any analysis that's been able to pair those two variables in terms of figuring out what the contribution is. So I wouldn't know how much of Canada's historical failures to meet targets can be attributed to its relatively slow pace of change on climate-related disclosures.
Thank you. We'll go to Mr. Deltel now.
Thank you. I'm very happy to see you again. It's always, your comments are always very relevant. So I have a very, very simple question for you. How would you define greenwashing? What is your definition of greenwashing? I'm going to ask my colleague to take that. I think now, not only in our recommendations, but I think we talked about that in our report as well. So maybe we can find that very quickly, or not. I'm just going to ask my colleague for a bit of help here. Well, the reason why I'm asking while you're searching is just to say that we can attribute a lot to greenwashing, and so I want to. I think the Commissioner of the Environment is the most neutral player in that. When we take the plane and we travel a lot and then we buy credits, that to me is greenwashing. You're polluting, but you relieve your conscience by buying that. So what is greenwashing and how can we assess it? When we're saying, how can we evaluate if an investment that we want to do is good? So, Mr. Marco, go ahead. So, and thank you for giving me some time to find the definition. Well, I could have continued a lot longer, but okay. No, it's on page 21 of our report. So we used this definition. It's the practice whereby a business or project claims in an imprecise or fraudulent way to represent a green investment. So greenwashing is sometimes called, there are other terms that are used as synonyms, but I'm happy that I was able to find it for you. Okay, well, thank you. And I appreciate your preciseness when we ask you a question. So again, it's very subjective. So what constitutes greenwashing for some person may not be what it is for other people. In Quebec, there is a project that, where people are the North Volt project, some people are really against it, some are not. So, well, I just heard the last part of this morning, the panels before me, but I think I heard people talking about taxonomy, and that's a method of establishing a framework for definitions. So is something green or not? And the degree of greenness. So that's one approach, the taxonomy. Now, it's not my office's role to decide what is green or not. But if an establishment like OSFI decides to use that, or a provincial institution decides to do that, it would be an advantage for all of us, because then we could see, is it green or is it column number 1, column number 2? Without a taxonomy, it's difficult for the public or investors to determine what is green or not. All right, thank you, Mr. DeMarco. Thank you, Chair. Welcome to our witnesses. So yes, we were hearing our witnesses earlier talked about the urgency of acting with regard to coming up with a taxonomy and transparency. And I was looking at our statistics we have 205 institutional or financial institutions that are supposed to be publishing their transition plan that is going to be in alignment supposedly with the Glasgow criteria. And the major economies of the world, some are 1 or even 2 years ahead of us in terms of requirements for their financial institutions. So to have a framework that brings certainty and that attracts investors. So the UK, the United States, EU, and even Australia, who has, who produces, there's Japan, Switzerland as well. But Canada is falling behind substantially in this area, and if we don't take action. So what I'm trying to understand is what is it that's slowing us down? I know that we have a natural resources economy, but that didn't stop Australia or from UK. There are countries that are investing several billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars. So what is slowing us down? Is it the conservatives and other voices that are, that are requiring us to stay in the old economy and not advance? There are billions of dollars that are going to miss us by, or go by us, and then they'll go to China. So what can we do to act quickly? Well, it's really a question of willingness. So yes, it is possible to go faster. And one of the reasons that we decided to audit OSFI is because the year before, we said that Canada risks falling behind with regard to other countries with regard to climate change resiliency. So it's a question of willingness. And I could even say that our first lesson, and in lesson 1, we said leadership and more effective coordination are necessary to make greater progress on climate change. So more leadership, more coordination, and the willingness to do this. And to not just say that there's a crisis, but to act as if there were a crisis. It's easy to say that there's a crisis, but it's more difficult to take action with diligence and quickness to deal with a situation like a crisis. All right, well, compared to Europe, I don't understand why, Europe is approaching net zero. It's changing its economy. It's changing its financial system. And it's becoming attractive to investors in the new economy. So what do they have that we're lacking here? And I know it's difficult with, the Western provinces, Alberta, for example. I know there's a premier who and the Conservatives who are saying no. That's you have no more time. It's a big question. but somebody could ask that to re-ask that question. All right, Ms. Posey, you have 2 minutes. All right, well, I would like to come back to what we were talking about before, Mr. DeMarco. So not just considering the financial impact, but also the environmental impact and social impacts. So we learned, thanks to our analysts here, that the Honorable Joe Oliver had said in the Financial Post in February that that OSFI should come back to its territory and focus on finance only and not environmental issues. So he thinks, and I share your point of view, but he's against that. The idea that OSFI takes, or that your office takes looks after the environment. So what are the risks of not dealing with the environment? Well, the choice of whether OSFI should have that role or not is the government's decision to make. They could change the OSFI Act. But the risk associated with, is the possibility of incoherent policies among various organizations at the federal level. So if we're aiming at a horizontal approach, and there could be negative impacts on the objective. That's the risk. So the risk of incoherency, and that we won't meet our objectives because not all organizations will be working towards the same end. Thank you, Ms. Posey. Ms. Collins, you have 2 minutes.
Oh. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks again to the Commissioner for being here. I'm curious, would you agree with the statement that OSFI is compelling firms to quantify and disclose their climate risks without actually taking action to limit the sources of that risk in the first place?
So we haven't done a follow-up audit yet on how they've implemented our recommendations. I've been given a summary of the steps they've taken, which I summarized very briefly in my opening statement. But I would be hesitant to answer what their current approach is based on the steps they took in response to our audit without having done that follow-up work. So I can't say that I can answer that question.
And would that statement have been fair when you did your audit?
Can you say the statement again, just to make sure?
Sorry, would that, so would it be fair to say that OSFI is compelling firms to quantify and disclose their climate risks without actually taking action to limit the sources of that risk in the first place?
At the time of our audit, the guideline was still a draft, I think. So they weren't compelling anything new on climate. Climate was always a regular material risk that could be considered under the regular list of risks that they could. So I would say that the answer was that they likely were not compelling as of the date of our audit. And I wish I could tell you exactly where they are at now, but I think it would be better to hear it directly from OSFI if they can tell you what progress they've made since 2 years ago.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. We'll go to Mr. Cram for 4 minutes, please.
Mr. Chair, thank you to the witnesses for joining us yet again this week. You're some of our best and most reliable customers, if I can put it that way. I just want to make sure that we're on the same page when it comes to some of the terms that we're using. Mr. DeMarco, in your opening statements, you used the term climate risks. What's the definition of a climate risk?
Okay. The question's not long enough for me to shuffle through all my pages to find the definition, but I'll do it something easier. We have the two risks, right? We have physical risks and transition risks summarized in our report, and Monsieur Lequin can probably elaborate on that.
So we have, yes. So physical risk is when, due to a weather event or a climate-related event, there is a disruption in the business model, or a destruction in stock that is has an impact because the capability of this company to pay back, for example, its financial commitment could be jeopardized. So this is really due to the physical impact of the climate. There is also what we call the transition risk, which is when there is emerging new technology, usually what's happening on the marketplace, there is repricing of some assets. So for example, now you see the solar is becoming cheaper, so it's become a competitor in some instances to produce electricity compared to a more traditional way of producing electricity. That has an impact on the business model of some company, and again, it could impact their capability of paying back their financial commitment.
Okay, so if you have a business that's at physical risk of an extreme weather event, that's what we're talking about here. Okay, so is that something that, like, I would think any investors doing their due diligence would be doing that regardless of any environmental policies. Like if there are checks and balances in place before you build a building that's in an earthquake zone, isn't that already being done by private sector investors independently of government policies?
So, yeah, a self-interested actor is supposed to be able to take in all of those risks, factor them in, and make rational decisions. If that always worked, we wouldn't have any tragedy of the commons. We wouldn't have government regulators. OSFI wouldn't be there for any of the traditional risks because they would already be factored in. But we do have market failures, such as externalities that occur. And usually a regulator or a self-regulating body will come in and try to address those sorts of things. So OSFI's been doing that for years, obviously, because banks are important to Canada's economy, and we don't want to see them fail. So they're there to stabilize the macroprudential framework. Climate is just the most recent identifiable risk, along with other things like cybersecurity and so on that have surfaced and that have to be factored in. Will the market factor them in perfectly efficiently and avoid market failures without a regulator like OSFI? That's an interesting question. I would say you'd have to ask an economist about that, an expert in the field.
Okay, and we're talking about climate-related emissions and exposure data. So if you have a company that is going to offer up its climate exposure data, that implies that they must have an understanding of how much they're at risk to, say, an extreme weather event. Is that true?
Briefly, please, Commissioner.
Yeah, so they would want to disclose their risks associated with physical risks, such as a flood or a storm, and their risks to their risks associated with transitional risks in terms of market changes, as Mr. Lequin just explained.
Mr. Van Koeverden.
Thank you, and welcome back to committee. Appreciate, gentlemen, you returning and providing all of your insights, perspectives, and expertise. I had a really brief question about greenwashing because I'm interested in it as well, and my friend and colleague, Monsieur Deltel, talked about carbon credits. Like, I've purchased carbon credits before. I don't feel like I'm greenwashing. I don't know if they're necessarily a form of greenwashing so much as when, like, a bank suggests that their mutual funds or bonds are so much greener than others when they're clearly not. Can you explain to me the difference or the definition between greenwashing on the side of like a consumer choosing to offset versus a business kind of tricking consumers?
Yeah, so a poorly constructed carbon offset could be a form of greenwashing if it doesn't have the attributes of additionality and permanence. So not all offsets lack those things, but some do, and it could be argued that those that do not create, do not have those attributes of additionality and permanence are de facto greenwashing. But if you design the offset well, then no, it wouldn't be greenwashing.
Okay, cool. That's super helpful. Thank you. I have another question about bonds. Now, the government debt is something that I think a lot of Canadians are concerned about, and rightfully so. They ought to be. They ought to have questions about government debt. I count myself among them. However, I also know that when government creates debt, they sell bonds to people, and then oftentimes folks will say, "Oh, the payments that governments make on debt just like go off into the wind, as if we're like, literally shooting interest into the sun or something like that." It doesn't disappear. It goes into people's portfolios. It goes into mutual funds, and I don't know how green bonds really work in that context. And I've heard people talk about Canada's new green bonds in the context of our new $5 billion bond. And I'd love to hear your reflections on how a green bond kind of works in the economy, how more inclusions or perhaps more exclusiveness in the bond would make them more effective.
Yeah, so this relates to taxonomies in terms of what's eligible for a green bond and whether it's, affecting the change that you are hoping in terms of it financing public transit or tree planting or whatever the case may be. We haven't done an audit of the new green bond system in a performance audit of the green bond system at the federal level. So I wouldn't be able to conclude on how well it's going in the initial stages from a performance audit point of view. Obviously, we have the financial side in terms of whether the numbers add up and so on, but we haven't done any performance auditing of that new system. So I can't tell you how well it's designed or how well it's being implemented in the early stage, but it's becoming more and more common across the world, as you know.
Okay, would you say that our steps to take a green bond program on as an approach, as we did with the 7.5-year, $5 billion green bond, was a good step in the right direction or a good start?
Yeah, that was a policy choice of the government. Having not done any audit of the design of it, I'd be hesitant to say yay or nay on that.
How long would it need to be active for in order to provide you with good enough data? Like, I presume that after a year or two of a 7.5-year bond yield, it wouldn't necessarily provide enough data, or am I wrong?
Well, it depends what the bond is being used for. So if it's going towards very long-term projects that no results are available, then you would have to wait quite a while for it to be ripe enough to audit from a performance and result-oriented perspective. We could audit it early on from a design perspective, which is we've done with some other areas. Yeah, it all depends on which performance indicators we wanted to look at, the design ones or implementation ones.
We're out of time, and I want to thank the Commissioner again for coming to see us. He always leaves us with a deeper understanding of the challenges we face on the environmental front. Thank you again, Commissioner. We look forward to seeing you soon enough. And before we break, colleagues, I just want to give you an update on the meeting we're having with oil company CEOs. I'm pleased to report that we can get 4 of the 5 on the same date, which from an organizational point of view has benefits. The only one who cannot come, the only CEO who cannot come on June 6th is the CEO of Enbridge. For scheduling reasons, they don't object to appearing. They could send somebody from the next level down to appear, in which case we'd have 5 on 5 in one meeting. Otherwise, we would have to have Enbridge come by themselves for an hour some other time, which would probably eat into other things we're doing. So, are we all right with having a vice president or whomever come on behalf of Enbridge and join the 4 CEOs of oil companies? I'll go to Ms. Collins because it's her motion.
Can I reserve judgment? Can we decide that we're going forward with the 4 on the date that we can secure them on, and come back after just a little bit of time to reflect on whether it's
I'll ask the question again at the next meeting, But the advantage is we could get this done in 2 hours. Otherwise, we do 2 hours and another hour some other time for Enbridge. And I don't know when we can get them and so on. So I'll come back. I'll ask the question again at the next meeting. We will all have had a chance to think about it, I guess, Mr. Deltel.
Juste pour être sûr,
Just to be sure, by memory, the initial request was to have all 5 on one day, all 5 CEOs at one meeting for 2 hours. Is that right? Yes, it seems. I think 2 hours that'll be at least 2 hours. And then we're getting 4 out of 5, 4 CEOs out of 5. Enbridge cannot send their CEO. Apparently, they have a board meeting or something, but they could send another senior executive, a senior executive, with all due respect for a spokesperson, it would require a vice president. Yes, indeed, I spoke to someone who represents Enbridge, and I mentioned that we don't want someone to deliver public relations. We want someone who is really in the thick of the operations of the business. In that case, yes. So you agree, the Conservatives agree, the Bloc agrees?
I'd say that we agree tentatively. I think, as Mr. Deltel said, I think it'd be of the utmost importance that we not just hear government relations speak, that we get somebody who is accountable.
That's what I've asked for. So, Ms. Collins, everyone seems to agree that if we get somebody who's,
a vice president, not a GR.
Yeah. No, we don't want a press secretary.
I'm open to this. Just to confirm.
We have a lot of respect for the press secretaries, but in this case,
absolutely.
In this case, we want to hear from somebody who's in operations. Sorry, go ahead, Ms. Collins.
Just to confirm, the previous correspondence, I was under the understanding that Imperial Oil originally had said that they were only available on the June 4th date, along with Enbridge, and so I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah. Everybody's coming on the 6th.
Everyone's coming on the 6th.
And
okay.
Enbridge as well, if we can agree to have someone other than the president, but who is a top decision maker.
Yeah, I think that sounds reasonable.
Okay, great. So we've got a plan.
And
everyone, yeah.
Mr. Shirk, is there any way to ask for them to appear in person?
I don't know if you can actually summons them to appear in person, but I don't think they will, to be honest with you. They will be virtual. I don't think we can force them to appear in person, honestly.
Maybe as our chair, would you mind encouraging them to attend in person?
To do that, I will do that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so that's it for today, and we'll. Wait. Sorry. Oh yeah. So at the last meeting, we asked parties to submit a list of cooperatives they would like to hear from in the context of this study on finance. So please send any cooperatives you would like to potentially invite to the clerk by May 14th. That gives us enough time. So if there are cooperatives you want to invite, please give the names to the clerk by May 14th. And I just want to confirm that you agree that the bank CEOs, which I think the motion to summons them, I think is having its impact. You agreed to have them for 2 hours, of course. Wait, 2 hours? Il y en a 5.
2 hours, there are 5 of them. It takes us at least 2 hours to really question them well.
Bonne fin de semaine à tous et à toutes.
Have a good weekend, everyone, and I look forward to seeing you in about 10 days. Thank you.